This question would be for Dr. Sachedina. I'm really curious. All the panelists, I believe, represent the more liberal spectrum of their respective faith traditions. How do we engage these triumphalist Muslims or fundamentalist Christians in these important discussions so that they don't devolve into us talking to each other and not really bringing some others in?
I think we need to engage those elements in their own terms rather than estranging them and imposing our categories on them. We need to engage them in the language of authenticity that they consider to be authentic. And I'm talking about scriptural ethics here. If I engage only in the rational ethics, then I'm usually defeated by those elements in the community because they challenge my knowledge of the scripture itself. But what I have tried to do is to go back to the classical sources and come out from the classical sources arguing about the liberal theology that we need today. So, in other words, triumphalist theology can be defeated on its own terms, through its own sources, through a new interpretation which is authentic enough for them. I think this applies to even the fundamentalist elements in other traditions too.
All right. Question here.
Thank you very much for talking. I'm curious about the phrase image of God. I know it's in the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures. It, for me, shapes how I think about rights. I don't know much about whether that phrase or something similar is present in the Quran or the Hadith. I'm also curious how that concept plays out in Jewish thought, because I don't know much about that either, but I was just curious about that.
You want to go, please?
Yes. First, I can't resist commenting on something that Dr. Wilson said. There was one town where the rabbi, can you hear me? Yeah? There was a town where the rabbi was commenting on the fact that a number of his congregants had become Quakers. And he said, some of my best Jews are friends. The phrase, image of God, that you're referring to in the Hebrew Bible, in Hebrew is Tselem Elohim, and it's not a simple phrase. And it has received a lot of comment through the years, which means it's going to be impossible for me to give you a definitive answer about what it means. What is it about human beings that makes us in God's image? And what is the meaning of the word image, or tselem, in Hebrew? Does it mean that we have a certain dignity that does in fact inhere in us as persons? Does it mean that we have a certain kind of intellect that's unique on the earth? Does it mean that we have the capacity for certain kinds of human relationships? Does it mean that we have a certain creativity, that we share creativity with God? All of these have been suggested as what it means to be in the image of God. No one has really suggested the most literal meaning, which is that we look like God. No one in the Jewish tradition has really said that, has used that as the most literal meaning. Historically, who knows what the people who first used the phrase meant by it?
We do have the tradition about the image of God, but it does not, it's not taken as centrally important. The centrality is given to the human ability to know the right from the wrong. That's what the Quran says. Humans are known for their ability to know right from the wrong. because they've been created in God's nature. And God's nature makes the distinguish between right and the wrong, between good and the evil.
Hi, thanks to all the panelists for a great panel. This is a question for Dr. Wilson. Recently in American Christianity, at least, not Canadian, or maybe in Canadian, but I don't know, there's been a big uptake of human rights language being used in very conservative ways. So it's very popular, for example, for conservative Christians to say, my rights are being infringed if same-sex marriage gets allowed. So there's this sort of interesting uptake of human rights. Are you seeing that in Canada? And if so, what do you think is the proper response to it?
I mean, you can claim my rights are violated for whatever you disagree with. So what we're searching for is is there a common norm? Is there some commonality that against which they can be measured? I mean, the whole development of civil liberties, for example, or against defamation. I mean, haven't I got a right to say terrible things about you and defame you publicly? But the point is that there are limits on everything, on everybody's rights. I mean, anybody who stands up and calls fire in this hall that's not their right to do so, because the society has said that's not, free speech has limits. And I think any rights are limited. And we've recognized that in our society by traffic lights. You're not just able to speed down Queen's Park at 150 miles an hour. I mean, you might be, but you're going to get caught. So that we put limits on all rights. They're not without limits.
Thank you for your comments. I really enjoyed them. I'm in a dilemma because the question I had in mind, I wanted to ask, but I'll leave it to the moderator's discretion. The question I have is situated here in Ontario. You probably will recall that a number of years ago, in 2005, there was a very heated debate here about whether or not to allow religious arbitration under the Ontario Arbitration Act. And religious communities were quite involved in the consultation process that Miriam Boyd had led, and then in the end, the decision was made not to allow it, in fact, to ban religious arbitration under the Act. Anyway, I'm just curious to hear your views about whether that was the right decision.
Yes, it was a heated controversy in the Jewish community as well. Because there are Jews who will go to a rabbi in a number of situations. Remember I said that Judaism has a legal system. We do have Jewish divorce, all right? So there are Jews who are certainly in favor of religious arbitration, and there are Jews who themselves would not go to a rabbi for these things, who want to preserve it for those who do. And there are Jews who, when the issue of Sharia, which was the issue, came up in Ontario, were in favor of Sharia, the Sharia legal system being adopted, because they were afraid if it wasn't adopted, then they would take away this rabbinic arbitration. Having said that, speaking for myself, I am opposed to different legal systems for different groups of people in Ontario. If you want to have a mediation for a specific situation, my understanding of the law is you can do that. When it comes to things that have to be done legally, I think you have to go to a civil court, and I think it protects, I mean, you were talking about women, it certainly protects the status of women, because women in the most traditional communities are not really free to choose not to go to the religious court because they think that that they don't have rights there. If they choose not to go to a religious court, they will be exiled from that community. So even though there is Jewish divorce, rabbis in Canada cannot perform a second marriage for people who haven't also had a civil divorce. One more thing. Structurally, Judaism and Islam are very similar. So in terms of what Dr. Aziz was saying about no churches and no hierarchy, etc., that holds equally true. For Judaism, it doesn't mean it operates as purely as one might think. But many of the problems that face Muslims also face Jews, like in traditional Judaism, I said there's a Jewish divorce, but the man has to give it to the woman. The woman, if the man refuses to give it to the woman, she can't have a divorce. That problem also exists in Islam, all right? And from a religious point of view, speaking for the Reformed Jewish community in the province of Ontario, where we do have a Reformed Jewish divorce, it's egalitarian, all right? But that divorce will not be recognized by the Orthodox community.
I just want to make a contribution of what Christians can do in that situation. I remember that quite clearly when the issue of Sharia law in Ontario came up. I had just come from Sudan, where I met a lot of women who were getting out of Sudan because of Sharia law. So I was quite suspicious, but I didn't know much about it. But I phoned a Muslim female friend in Edmonton and said, what do you think I should do? And I phoned one in Kingston, asked her what to do. And both of them said, why don't you write a letter to the Globe and Mail asking a question? And the question would be, which of the 5 interpretations of Sharia law do you mean? So I did that. And it was, you know, a very short letter, six words or something. And they published it, and my sister-in-law from Ottawa phoned and said, Lois, I didn't know you knew that much about Sharia law. I said, I don't, so just ask.
I want to add only one comment that now Iraq and Iran, they have, this is Shia law, by the way. They have recognized the civil divorce as valid divorce. Religion simply then endorses what has already taken place in the civil courts. So this is only in Iraq and Iran. I don't know about other countries.
Since I always obey the moderator, especially this particular moderator.
Good policy.
I guess I have to address this question maybe to Lois, if I may, but I'd love to hear other comments. I think the biggest...
Nicely done, Joe. Just slip that in, yeah.
I think the biggest issue in the issue of religion and human rights in Canada today is the government's decision to set up with $5 million the new Office of Religious Freedom. There's only one other Office of Religious Freedom anywhere else in the world, I understand, to the south of us, the country to the south of us. There are some ways to do this poorly. There are some ways to do this well. There are some people to be included in the discussions. Would you like to suggest ways that this Office of Religious Freedom should be done, should be set up well, and what things should be avoided like the plague?
When I was in the Senate, there were a group of us who met with Foreign Affairs, trying to get them to accept an interfaith committee that would provide Foreign Affairs with the context, the religious context of in a given country when there was some issue of human rights. We thought that would be a useful advisory thing. That never happened because the government fell. But I think that's the approach I think would be useful, for an interfaith approach to government, to say this is what we think could work. My worries about the current thing is it going to apply within Canada, where there's a lot of religious discrimination, or is it just so that we're seen as good Boy Scouts overseas?
Thank you very much, all three of you. I really appreciated your presentations. This is directed to Dr. Sachedina, and it's a carryover from Dr. Waltersdorf's talk and some of his points relating to inherent rights. I was struck by your initial comment about the direct relationship between a Muslim and God, or Allah. And you kind of moved away from the idea of community in saying we have no church. I'd like to dwell a little bit on that if we could, not because, again, moving on from the question I asked Dr. Waltersdorf regarding covenant and since we're all in the covenantal tradition, so to speak, I'm interested to know how Muslims deal with that isolated, if I may call it that, idea of their relationship with God as opposed to the community. You seem to build community as more of a nationalistic concept, but I'd lost, where does Islam fit in terms of human relationships and the covenant idea? And does that help in terms of understanding inherent rights as Dr. Waltersdorf has interpreted it?
Characteristic features of Islamic ethics is that it is communitarian, and yet it recognizes autonomy as an important part of the communitarian ethics. How do they balance autonomy in terms of relational ethics? It is always a puzzle for me, that how exactly does that play out in the practical terms when my autonomous decision is always weighed in terms of my familial and societal relationships. And that's how I gain support for my rights, so to speak. I think the distinction not being between private and the public somehow creates this gray area, which is left to the autonomy of an individual, but individual is not seen as the self-regulating moral agent. Rather, moral agency is viewed in terms of the individual's relationship with the others. And I think it's sometimes a struggle to make a distinction between the two. I was counseling a couple in Toronto. Man was suffering from the muscle dystrophy and was slowly, becoming smaller and smaller, not able to control anything. For 18 years, the wife and the family took care of that man. But whenever we asked him if the ventilator should be turned off, he said no. And there, although we saw clearly a tension between the familial burden of the whole enterprise of taking care of someone for all these years, and the individual right, Islam was on the side of the autonomy. It said as long as he or she makes a conscientious decision, you have to respect it. In other words, you have really a struggle between private and public domains in the Islamic tradition.
Judaism is very communal and very communally oriented. So one of the problems we have in this culture is that this culture is very individualistic and thinks so autonomously and so individually that it's not easy to communicate what it means to belong to a community and have communal values, and that sometimes these communal values take precedence over individuality. So there is the same tension in Judaism, but I don't think our problem in this culture is staking out a place, at least among Jews, staking out a place for yourself individually. Our problem is to convince people that community is important.
Yeah, and I think this bears on the question you asked me about my rights against same-sex marriage, wherever you are. That's what I was trying to say, that I don't think the whole language of rights is appropriate in that discussion, but whether or not you think so, the point that the rabbis made is the point I've been trying to make. There must be communal values by which we live, which may not always suit individuals.
Okay, there's one over there.
Some remarks have been made about the representatives up there being out of the liberal traditions, and that the traditional clergy aren't here. It seems to me that if I'm hearing you correctly, and I could be misreading, but that each of you is using a division between public and private, and in some ways shifting some of the basic concerns into the private realm and buying sort of a rational public realm kind of argument. So I might be misreading that, but that seems to be the move. And the question that comes to my mind then is, how out of your own faith tradition do you justify that move?
Well, I don't think this is a rational approach at all. It's deeply biblical. I'll never forget 1983 at the World Council Assembly in Vancouver when Desmond Tutu arrived, and he's an actor, you know, and he arrives at midnight knowing that here he comes. And he came and he held up the Bible. It was the center of apartheid struggle. He held up the Bible and he said, "Have you people never read this thing? You brought it to us. Did you not expect us to read it?" I mean, his whole life was to overturn the public sphere. And it's the prophetic heritage in the Hebrew Bible, for me, that does it.
Two people are arguing about their religions, and they argue for many hours, and finally one says to the other, "Okay, look, when all is said and done, we both try to follow God's path. You in your way, me in God's." Wait, I'm not. Yeah. No one has really raised the question of truth. All right? Our traditional understanding is that my religion is true and every other religion is false. All right? But if you want to talk about public space and respect for the dignity of other people, how can I live with and work with other people and believe that everything they think and cherish is false? All right? Can there be multiple truths? We have not, and we certainly don't have time, to address the whole question in a multi-religious society of truth.
This is for Abdulaziz. We've talked about this, you and I have talked about this before, but I've forgotten the answer you gave me. So what I'd really like to know is about the strand of human rights thinking within Islam. What is that strand? How far back does it go? Does it begin within Islam itself, or is it the result of outside Western influences? And the people in that strand today, how would they be inclined to ground human rights in human dignity or something else, or not really talk about what it's grounded in? So I'd really like, you see what I'm asking, that strand within Islam.
The classical texts provide some of us who are working on human rights in Islamic tradition with good ammunition to fight those apologists who think that whatever Islam has done is enough. You know, we really have a human rights document with us, what Islam has offered. And we all know that it is discriminatory. It's not exactly what we talk about. Certainly, I think human rights language is a modern language, and therefore it derives much of its terminology from the modern English or French translated into Arabic and Persian. Having said that, you have already something embedded within the tradition itself which talks about the human rights. And we have this, the famous Quranic verse about the rights of the women, and it starts with the rights. وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ. Her rights are in proportion with her duties. It starts with the rights and talks about the responsibilities. So you already have something within the tradition. Also, we have policy statements by the caliphs saying that, you know, Muslims who have conquered Egypt, they are going to be a minority in Egypt. They are conquerors. They are imperialists. Therefore, when they go to Egypt, which is largely Christian, They have to treat Egyptian Christians as equal in creation. So there are two kinds of the people in Egypt, the document says, and that's the way it was implemented. Imma akhun laka fid din, either they are your brethren in your religion, or imma nadirun laka fil khalq, or they are your equal in creation. In other words, there is already a language that can lend itself very easily to the modern discourse on human rights. This is what I work on, trying to use the classical language and not to depart from it, 180 degrees, rather keeping within it so that I can then propose a public theology that is far more conducive to modern day understanding of human rights. Therefore, individualism and autonomy is very important. When I talk to the women, I am insisting on their autonomy. And it is provided by the Quran itself. The Quran says, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have honored all the children of Adam. That means men and women are equal in that case. So that way, women can fight back male dominance by insisting upon their human dignity being given by God as individuals. So you have communitarian ethics competing sometimes with individual ethics, which is rationalistic.
Judaism believes in two covenants. Most people know that in Judaism there is a covenant between God and the people of Israel, the Jewish people. But most people don't know about the other one. In Judaism there's a covenant between God and all human beings called the covenant of Noah. Because in the Bible, after the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah. And Noah is a kind of generic human being. So Judaism believes in the covenant of Noah, and because in Judaism covenants have behavioral contents, there's something called the 7 commandments of Noah. And they're, for the most part, general moral behaviors. From the Jewish point of view, any person who strives to live by any non-Jewish person who strives to live by the covenant of Noah and the commandments of Noah is acceptable in God's eyes. Any religion that teaches people to live by these commandments is an acceptable religion in God's eyes. In Judaism, there has never been any such thing as no salvation outside the church. So from that point of view, we have available to us already existing language to deal with generally human society. There are problems, however, internally in Judaism in terms of the content, the behavioral content of the covenant between God and the people of Israel. And there are many disagreements about that. And we liberals believe that some of them in the more Orthodox community do violate human rights. However, historically, there is considerable debate within the Orthodox community about the meaning of different behaviors. It's not monolithic by any means, but we do, in the liberal community, we do have criticisms, and the more Orthodox you become, the more ultra-Orthodox you become, the more criticisms we have.
Isn't it great hearing these two men defend human rights for women?
Today we are just over halfway through the 5-year mandate for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which is a commission or a mandate that addresses the legacy of colonialism, most particularly through the residential schools and the impact on Indian, Métis, and Inuit children. My question in particular to Rabbi Stroh and Professor Sachedina is, what are some of the ways in which you imagine that your communities can really participate in and assist the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and be agents for healing and reconciliation in this work?
I think that this is one of the very important areas of reconciliation and peace building. Honestly, the internal debate between the Shia and the Sunni, which needs to begin at some point, has not as yet begun. Because history shows the ugly face of the agents who function in the history. Shia-Sunni history is a very sad history of separation. And there's a lot of suffering of human beings, a lot of killing of innocent life. I think the day the Sunni majority begins to listen to the Shia minority, we might change the situation in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Pakistan, in India, where there are communal riots between Shia and the Sunni. I don't think we have started as yet. We have not faced the history as it ought to be faced. And that's the only key to the truth and reconciliation. You need to somehow face the ugly past. Then only you can begin to forgive. Then only you can begin to show the compassion that is necessary to show to the minority. But as long as the majority continues to demonize the minority, you have no way to reconcile. This is the story that I know of the Islamic situation.
Hans Küng said there will be no peace among nations until there's peace among religions. Religious belief is probably, for those who believe, the strongest and most tenacious belief that there is, and it can be the strongest thing that separates people.
This follows up on a point that was raised by a number, but I think I'll direct it to Lois. The issue of values versus rights, it seems to me that we might be exaggerating the distinction. I mean, as a human rights practitioner in Canada, I find that the most important decisions that courts are making these days, they're actually turning to what they're talking about as human rights values or fundamental values. And the way our charter works is, even though you can establish a violation of a right, the court then turns to determine whether it's a reasonable limit. And as you were mentioning, Lois, everything has limits, and the decisions about limits are really the critical issues on which we win and lose these critical cases. So if we're in court, as we were recently with an undocumented migrant denied access to health care, at risk to her life, the court found that in Canada you can deny access to health care to an undocumented migrant to risk her life, to violate her right to life, but it's in accordance with fundamental justice in Canada to do so. That's the bad kinds of decisions. And on the good side, we've had issues like it's contrary to the charter to deport Mavis Baker when she has children relying on her staying here. The decision was made on the basis of charter values, international human rights values. My question as a human rights practitioner is, it seems to me that we've lost, and internationally I would mention, 20 years ago, we relied on Canada internationally to stand up for international human rights values. Now, when I'm at the UN, colleagues come up to me and they're just absolutely shocked and appalled at the positions that Canada's taking. We're opposed to the right to water. We're opposed to people having a voice to be able to claim rights to freedom from violations of their right to an adequate standard of living or a right to food. So what has happened to the kind of congruence between what I would think are shared value systems of the various faith groups and the work that we're doing on the human rights side? And what can we in the human rights community do to try to somehow draw on those shared values to get the support of the faith communities as we're taking these kinds of cases forward? Because we're not really hearing strong voices of disapproval when we're getting decisions that, in my view, run contrary to values that I know, Lois, you have fought for all your life.
Well, I think partly religious communities sometimes just give out general principles, but don't know the nitty-gritties of human rights law, don't know the charter rights, don't know the human rights laws. I mean, I'm in total despair about Canada's record internationally because they've shredded it, whatever reputation we used to have. And we need to reclaim that. It's one of the big things that needs to happen in Canada. first of all, the dissemination of information about human rights, which people do not have. In the religious communities, many would not like the decision, but they don't know enough about the internal workings of the covenants or the laws to protest. And whether they would do that is another question, but they don't have the information. And I'm not sure how to get that to them. I think that people are propelled to take action on human rights when they are personally involved or they know somebody else who's personally involved. Beyond that, of course, they'll do it whether they know anybody's involved or not personally, but that's the first line of attack. So I don't know, that's just what I think, that plus a lot of the religious communities, I mean, meditation is very strong in the religious communities now. If you offer a meeting on meditation, the place will be packed, but if you offer it on human rights, it'll be quarter full. So we've turned in, we're examining our belly buttons, sort of. The religious community has turned in upon itself for who am I and so on. So it's all a meditation, salvation thing for my own soul, for many people. And they've lost any political dimension, not realizing that human rights and salvation has a political dimension. So it's theological as well as practical, in my view.
Because we are dealing with immigrant communities that come from autocratic governance from their own countries. They are not used to challenge the government. They are not used to even participate politically to redress some of the wrongs that are being committed. This whole business of honor killing that also happens in our backyard here in this country. We are not willing to see it as such. We have somehow, human rights advocates have adopted what I call cultural relativism as an argument to leave them, oh, okay, they don't understand. The UDHR, Universal Declaration, they don't understand. On the contrary, I think the more they're made aware of it, and we really have to stand firm in what we call the intervention that is needed many times. It's like the genital mutilation, in the what we call the practice that is found in African countries, it's found in the Middle East countries, and if we don't speak up, if we don't raise the voice, and don't encourage, empower the people who can do it, then I think we are not fulfilling our obligation to the UDHR. I'm committed to that in my book, that UDHR is a document we have to go by. And we have to observe that. Now, autocratic governments in the Middle East would say this is hegemonic, this is Eurocentric, this is Amerocentric, but human being is a human being who is deprived of the rights. And in those countries, if we don't raise those, because Saudi Arabians are a good buddy, we don't raise the same voice as we raise, let's say, about Iran. Now, our hypocrisy leads, to further violation of human rights. We need to be consistent where we stand in terms of human rights. If we are not consistent, we'll damage everything that we are achieving in terms of human rights of those who are abused day and night, and you won't believe we don't hear about them. We don't hear anything about them. There are hundreds of women who are suffering in the health care that they don't receive. In the experimentation that is done in medical research, women's dignity is not observed. And we keep quiet. We don't, because Saudi Arabia is a good buddy. We need petrol from them, It doesn't work that way. Human rights cannot be relativized.
Yeah, could I just comment to that? You're quite right. I mean, human rights in China, but we want China as a trading partner. I mean, the whole political trade-off thing is there, for sure. And I think that if newer faith communities are afraid of political power, those of us who lived in Canada all our lives are not, and it's about time we said what we think.
Just going back from the beginning, I think it comes back to just that language and deconstructing the language, the definition of what human rights is. The first speaker was talking about justice, and justice was based on what a person's rights is. And from rights, it goes to what's the value of a person. And I was so glad you started off, the moderator, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In Article 6, it says, everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. And I wanted to know, what any of the speakers, what's your definition of a person? It comes back to deconstructing the language. Here it says, you have the right to be recognized as a person, but if we can't define what a person is, then how can you define what your right is? How can you define what the justice of those rights are if everyone can't agree what a person is? Because in every country, what a person may be, a woman and a man is not defined equally as a person. And everywhere we're talking about genital mutilation, we're talking about forced marriage, we're talking about labor laws that are being broken. I consider myself a Christian abolitionist because I work in human trafficking. And these are being broken everywhere because the definition of what a person is not acceptable everywhere. So if anyone wants to take that question, what would you define a person to be under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? What's the definition of a person?
Who would like that? Rabbi?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. We use all kinds of words that not only we don't know the meaning of, but sometimes we don't agree on the meaning and we think we're communicating and we're not. I think by person, we mean human being. And the reason I say human being is that both historically and currently, not every human being has been recognized as a human being. All right, I talked about Greek philosophy. To Aristotle, not all people whom we would regard as human beings were human beings. Only Greeks were by nature full human beings. I think that by human being, we mean a person in whom certain rights inhere in the person that are inalienable. All right? They cannot be taken away, and the person cannot give them away. And I do think that is a post-Enlightenment value. It's a Western value. And I think it's something we have to religiously embrace. And we will find many resources in our religions to do that, because ultimately I think we believe that is the intention of our religions as they grow and develop. All right? Now, I'm saying this off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'd applaud that and add that what I said earlier, that in my view, a person is fully a person in relationship to other people, to others. It's got a relational dimension.
Probably towards the Reverend Lois Wilson, in terms of being active in the public sphere, do you think that the problem is, I'm referring specifically to the media?
Can you put the microphone a little bit further? Okay. No, a little further away. Further away.
Okay. In terms of the media, is there a problem in that today's politics is so fast and oversimplified that the media always looks towards, for example, the Christian perspective or the Jewish perspective whenever an issue emerges? Do you think that's a problem because it fails to recognize the diversity within each of the communities?
Well, the media reflects the community. So I don't see any point in blaming the media. I mean, I look upon the media as a colleague, and we ought to be in conversation with them if we are critical of them. On the other hand, they're very powerful too, but I mean, they do reflect community values. That's how they make their money, and if they were, go against them, and pretty soon you get cuts. Look at what's happened to the CBC.
What I find about the media is that the attitude of the media towards religious minorities is make them colorful, by which I mean whenever a Jewish holy day comes up, there's a picture in the newspaper. It's always of the most ultra Orthodox Jew they can find with a long beard and wearing black clothes and so on, because a picture of the person in my synagogue looks like everybody else and is simply not interesting.
But come back to my point of their colleagues. I mean, you know, I was active in North Korea, led the first government delegation into North Korea to establish diplomatic relations, which we then ignored. But the point is, I remember seeing a so-called documentary by a very respected CBC television reporter on North Korea, and it was full of hands being held up saying you couldn't take a picture of me. I mean, what did he expect? So what I did is I emailed him and said, you know, we've just sent 10 people to North Korea from Canada. Would you like to meet them and find out what their perceptions are? He had no contact with anybody who'd ever been to North Korea. So what I'm saying is, can you not look upon these people as in need of some assistance?